WNST to watch the likes of Croatia and Iceland play soccer, or football as they call it around the rest of the world. I love the World Cup. Everyone knows that. And I spent some time over in Germany in '06 chasing the U.S. team around and had no idea but could only guess as to the corruption level of FIFA and the U.S. and everyone else around the world as to why these games are in Moscow right now, why we are playing games in Qatar 4 years from now out of season when it's 120 degrees. Ken Bensinger has tried to put all of this together, and I've followed the raids in Switzerland. I know about Chuck Blazer's weirdness, but this book that he has put out that just came out this week called Red Card, the world's most popular game was also the most corrupt. Who knew, Ken Bensinger? First off, welcome in. I'm going to send everybody out to follow you out at Ken Bensinger on Twitter, as well as your book, Red Card, which can be ordered pretty much anywhere books are. And I know people are enamored with the World Cup. We all love the game. And then we find out just how this thing works. And I remember reading these stories and these exposés on Blazer a couple of years ago. I'm really looking forward to seeing your deep dig, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Let me chat about it. It's been a deep dig. It's been something I've been working on for years now, so I'm excited to see it out in the world.
Well, okay, let's start with this. You've been working on it for years. I mean, it came to me, I don't know, a New York story, New York Times, something, after the FIFA thing went down, that this really brazenly, fat guy that was kind of oafish, that would eat all these huge meals and had this weird lifestyle, that lived in Trump Tower, would be the most corrupt guy in America as far as it came to sport, because he sort of went on unchecked, right? Like the real story is, how did it get so far gone? And I guess everyone was getting paid off all around the world, which is why these games are in Russia right now, thanks to the oligarchs.
Yeah, I mean, I think you got a couple sort of a caustic mix of a couple ingredients that allow this kind of thing to happen. But in the U.S., a guy like Chuck Blazer can get away with being a crook because no one cares enough about the sport to really pay attention. It kind of flies beneath the radar of a lot of public scrutiny. I mean, this is a guy who was at one point, his peak was one of the most powerful men in all of world soccer, and yet could, walk the streets of New York completely anonymously, which is something that soccer officials can't do in their countries and the rest of the world. The sport's so popular there. And in fact, it's that popularity in the rest of the world that has protected officials because it's so powerful there. It's as if the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, the NHL were all squashed into one thing. That's how big it is in most countries. It's so powerful, but those people almost like they're above the law. Politicians and law enforcement are terrified to mess with soccer in those countries. And so in those countries, people knew things were dirty, but they were terrified to touch it for fear of somehow damaging soccer or getting in trouble with it. So that's how it avoids it. That led to this culture of incredible impunity where everyone thought they could do whatever they wanted, take whatever they wanted, and never, and never get in trouble for it. And it wasn't until the Department of Justice got involved starting in 2010 that change began.
Well, I would ask you, I mean, he went on unchecked and lived the life of a king for 2 decades, literally, right? Like, he never really paid any sort of ultimate price. He died at 72 of poor health, but the whole last 4 years of his life wearing wires on behalf of the government, I mean, run me through all of that and your involvement. I'm always more interested in the author than I am the story, having written a couple of books myself and known when that weird moment happens when you're like, I've got to write a book. And, I've always thought this Blazer thing, literally one of the reasons I sought you out to have you on, not just during the World Cup, but it came to me on Twitter, was I've always thought this is the wildest effing story I've ever heard. I mean, I've been doing this 33 years professionally since I was 15 years old. I was a reporter in the 80s. I've covered rock and roll. I've covered hockey. I've covered rock stars. I've covered, Bruce McNall, buying the LA Kings with broken money. I mean, hell, what's going on with our government right now and Wag the Dog kind of blows me away on a daily basis. But the Blazer story, of all the stories I've ever heard in sport, of cheating and, all sorts of stuff with steroids in baseball. This was the most brazenly sort of out there story, and I know you've tried to capture it in Red Card.
Yeah, well, that's right. You know, if you're interested in the reporter story, I first wrote about Chuck Blazer in 2014, and I wrote a big profile of him because he come on my radar, and I thought, as you feel, it's a heck of a crazy story. He's an unusual character if there ever was one, but no one ever really written about him, and so I wrote a big profile of him before the last World Cup, and I talked a lot about all of his suspect behavior and how much money he'd made from the sport and how he'd been doing it for years and how he lied about his background and this, that, and the other thing. But no one at the time knew he was cooperating with the government. I'd heard rumors that something might be going on, but no one would admit to anything.
Well, he was legitimately, kind of like the guy running our country. He's like a professional con, right? Like, he ran a 35-year con, literally, right? That began with Pele, right?
Yeah, I mean, it began in the late 1970s when he was running youth soccer in Westchester County, New York. It goes to the US Soccer Federation, where he was briefly, for 2 years, the executive vice president. Then he runs a thing called the American Soccer League, which is a failed league that came out in the period of time before the MLS ever opened. And he was a commissioner of that league, and then he was president of the Miami Sharks. At one point, he paid himself. He made his own paycheck. And his paycheck was larger than the entire payroll of the entire team. He paid himself more than every player combined, right? So he saw everywhere he went as an opportunity to make himself rich. And everything failed constantly until he hit on one good idea, which is to get this guy from Trinidad elected head of the confederation that rules over North and Central American and Caribbean soccer. And when he got that guy elected, and he got himself into a sweet position where he could give himself a contract, he wrote his own ticket, he wrote his own contract that paid him 10% of all revenue that came in. And this was his golden goose that made him incredibly rich. Well, about a year after I wrote this article showing all this, we heard about these crazy arrests in Zurich, Switzerland, and all these FIFA guys dragged out of their hotel rooms and put in jail. And within a day or two, we also found out that he was one of the critical informants in the whole case, and as you mentioned, had been secretly cooperating with the FBI for years. At that point, your humble reporter here on the phone suddenly became the worldwide expert on this guy. And there was a great clamor for me to write a book. So that eureka moment was when the rest of the world reported that he was the cooperator, and I looked like the smart guy, even though I was just lucky. And within a couple of weeks, I had done a deal to write a book, and it was off to the races.
Ken Bensinger joins us here. The book is off to the races, and it's out there. It's Red Card: How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal. Peeling back the onion of all this, and I remember that morning I woke up, after the Swiss raid and read on, because I've been to Zurich. I went to the World Cup in Germany. I actually stayed in Zurich during the World Cup back in 2006 and drove across the border into Kaiserslautern, where Hitler held rallies, and it's sort of the Lambeau Field. It was built in like 1910, and the U.S. played Italy, and I saw the money and the prestige, and I saw all of that in Germany. I saw all the money, and Ken, I'm a guy that's covered 25 Super Bowls now, so I know what it looks like to sort of walk into these man-made league run, but I thought, where's all the money going from this? Like, there's no government behind any of it. It's a bunch of sort of lords of soccer who run the sport that runs everywhere outside the United States, and I guess it'll be running our place in 2026 here soon enough, as the games move back here, and we're not even in the tournament this time. But I really do itch as I sit here and watch Moscow, and I look on the front end of Qatar 4 years from now, when I wouldn't have even thought of going to Moscow this year, just because I just feel like it's filthy how all of this worked for so long about the money and where it went and the payoffs. I mean, I have no doubt there was mafia, entertainment involved in Brazil, in Moscow, in Qatar, this whole 12-year period of time, and Blazer's a part of it. But, I mean, this is just this quadrant of the world, right? Like, all of it was corrupt, right? It wasn't just centered in a Trump Tower penthouse with this weird dude. He was in on this with 50 other con men around the world, right?
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be fair to say the Blazer was the king of all this. It reminded me of a guy I learned about who was a corrupt Chilean soccer official. And the only thing that's important about the story is that if you ever talk to anyone in Chile, they believe he is the most corrupt person in the history of humanity, right? Well, in fact, he's just another corrupt soccer official. And I think the funny thing about the way this works is that every country loves its soccer, and every country has at least one and probably many hideously corrupt soccer officials running the show. It's everywhere, at every level of the sport. In fact, the prosecutors running the case called it endemic. That was the word that came up with it for it.
Well, it's kind of like the FBI
everywhere.
going after the college basketball people this year. Really? You know, I've been covering this for 40 years. It's the filthiest, dirtiest, slimiest, sleaziest thing you've ever seen, and everybody has sort of just accepted that, right? Like, for the most part, right?
Yeah, you're hitting the nail on the head. And the NCAA case is a good example. But really, this was really a case of it was an open secret, but no one was willing to do anything about it. Everyone knew it was dirty, everyone knew it was corrupt, but no one ever did anything about it for one reason or another, because it's too powerful, or because it's too complicated, or just no one had the willpower. And then finally it breaks through, and everyone goes, oh, of course, what are we waiting for? Why'd you wait so long, right? An interesting side note, by the way, about the NCAA case is that the story goes that case was in the Southern District of New York, which is the Manhattan Federal District. And the FIFA case was made out of the Eastern District of New York, which is in Brooklyn across the river. And they're rivals. And the day that the FIFA arrest happened in Zurich, Preet Bharara, who was still the U.S. Attorney for Southern District, threw a tantrum and was screaming in his office and called in all of his subordinates and said, I don't care what you do, but you better get me a sports case. Get me a sports case now. And that's how the NCAA case began.
Well, there you have it. Ken Bensinger, the book is Red Card. In putting this book together and having it come out right now, you know, what's the upshot of this? I mean, I know on the other side we'd like to say, well, it's all cleaned up now. It'll be better. It's coming to the United States. Look, you know, Trump was wringing his hands last week about how he got involved and all of this other stuff. And obviously, Mexico and Canada, who, you know, we have this creepy dude running our country, pissing everybody off. We're now partners with them, you know, on the biggest sporting event in the world, you know, coming up 8 years from now. Lord knows what prison he'll be sitting in at this point. We can only hope. But by the time this thing gets to 2026 and gets here, we're now into this. And I'm sure your book's going to get real popular right about then, and the Blazer story, because there's never going to be a better story than the Chuck Blazer story, as far as I can tell. And I am looking forward to reading your book and getting into it, because I can't imagine what went on there, the stories that can and can't be told. And of course, he died last year, so I guess all of it can be told right now. But, you know, this does not reflect any better upon the United States and our current leadership than anything that Putin has done and anything that a bunch of oil tycoons did out in the Middle East to bring in slaves to build stadia. So, you know, kings can go sit in stadia in Qatar when it's 142 outside 8 years from now, or 4 years from now, we're watching soccer. It's, you know, this whole, every 4 years it comes back. I mean, I remember itching 4 years ago when they kicked 150,000 Brazilians out of a neighborhood so that they could, you know, build a village, right? I mean, we've seen that, the Olympics, all of this that's gone on. But it's going to come to the U.S. shores in 8 years, too, and stories like Chuck Blazer are going to lead that, I think, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, he is the godfather, so to speak, of American soccer, and so his story is going to be told over and over again. It's impossible to understand what American soccer is today without his story. It's part of it. And as you said, he's one of the loudest, craziest characters in the history of the sport. I don't know if that's a particularly American thing or an accident, but we got one of the really we got one of the real crazy ones. And so that story is, I think it encapsulates in a nutshell all the problems in the sport, but also has this American twist, right? You know, he's just a larger-than-life character, and it's pretty wild. But I don't want to sell other people short. They all have their own fun stories. You can't have soccer without a Sepp Blatter either, and he really is like the original Bond villain. So it's really an incredible cast of characters, you know.
Well, Jack Warner. Let's talk about Jack Warner a little bit, because he's obviously a player in this, and you mentioned him. What has become of, you know what I mean? Like he's just sort of gone away, right? Like he was the dirtiest of dirty, and I haven't heard a word about him in years. I mean, is he sitting in a prison somewhere?
So he's sitting in Trinidad, where he's from, fighting extradition. So the DOJ is still trying to get him. He's been appealing and fighting and kicking and screaming since May 2015, trying to avoid extradition. And I think in the fall, we're going to see some important hearings in that case that could lead to his extradition.
But he's not in jail. He's like hanging out in Trinidad on the beach, literally.
Maybe not on the beach, but definitely hanging out in Trinidad. He's a very public figure there. He was a member of cabinet there. He was a high member of parliament there. And so he's an incredibly public figure. And so he's constantly rabble-rousing is what he does. But yeah, he is not in jail.
He's a criminal in our country, right? In the United States, he's a criminal here, but nowhere else, right? Like, this didn't relate to Switzerland and FIFA, or did it not?
It did, but the way it works is that if he's stuck in Trinidad, if he leaves, if he flies to any other country, there's a red notice from Interpol. So what that means is that if he flies into another country, the immigration department in those countries are going to pick him up, hold him, and notify the DOJ, and try to extradite him from those countries. So he's not going anywhere. In fact, there's a handful of guys just in that same situation. A bunch of Brazilians, him, a few other countries that they're hiding, avoiding extradition, but can never leave the country. So it's not exactly prison, but the government can make your life a little bit more comfortable. They freeze your assets. It won't let you travel, et cetera, et cetera.
But he's 75 years old, too. I mean, all the money he's stolen has been well used and well spent. It's one thing to catch a crook when they're 35. It's another thing to catch them when they're 75, right? Like, I think that's part of the issue we have going on with all these criminals in the Russia case in our own country that are going to be going to jail. It's, well, how much jail time are you going to do? And, you live life like a king for 3.5 decades, and now we're going to throw you in prison. I don't know that anybody cares, right? I mean, there's nobody in the United States clamoring for Jack Warner to die in an American prison, right? Other than the
well, that's right. And one of the guys who was convicted in this trial last December was 80 years old or something, and 79 or 80 years old, and so the guy's a complete crook. There's video of him like stealing, literally stealing medals from youth players and putting them in his pocket. But he's a Brazilian guy. He's 80 years old. Like, he's going to die in an American jail. It's almost sad, right? It's not going to deter, I don't think, the 28-year-old young Brazilian who wants to steal money from the game, because he just thinks, well, yeah, I'll do that. If I can get away with this for 50 years, fine, that's the deal I'll make. So, yeah, it's a bummer about the case that all these guys are really old, but those are the ones who were so brazen in what they did that it was easy to catch them.
All right, the book is Red Card. Ken Bensinger is our guest. You can find the book, How the U.S. Blew the Whistle on the World's Biggest Sports Scandal. It is World Cup related. I don't think you even need to be a soccer fan to really appreciate. It almost writes a little bit like a Tom Clancy novel, but it's real, and Chuck Blazer was a real dude who died last year. Give folks a taste. Give me a 2-minute story or some sort of a synopsis. If my audience, and there's a lot of people in my audience, my wife was unfamiliar with Chuck Blazer. I was talking about him over the weekend, and I was telling her how I was seeking out this guy in L.A. who wrote a book that I got to have on because it's the damnedest story you've ever heard or read. Let everybody in on a Chuck Blazer story about, let's just say, the penthouse and the money, and just give a little, introduce your book, because I think Chuck Blazer's worth knowing about.
Yeah, well, Blazer. So Blazer is. I think of him as the ultimate suburban soccer dad, reaching his greatest dreams. Right, he's the guy after the match who's your kid's sitting there eating the orange slices, and he says, "Well, if I ran soccer, I'd do this, that, and the other thing." And everyone laughs it off, except Chuck Blazer really did that. He's the guy. He grew up in Queens. This is the guy who, his claim to fame when he was younger was that he owned a button factory and would produced the buttons with the smiley faces on in the early 70s that were so popular. He'd never heard of soccer, never played it. His kids got into youth soccer in Westchester County, and then he climbed the ranks. But when he was at the top, he's dating a former soap opera actress. He's got apartments in Miami and in the Bahamas, and he's traveling the world. Everyone is courting him for attention. And I think one really fun story about him is that in 2010, when Russia, which now has the World Cup, is trying to, get votes so that it'll be the host, they fly Blazer to Moscow, and he's brought to Vladimir Putin's office for a sit-down with Putin. And he sits down and chats face-to-face with Putin, and Putin tells him he's great. And Putin takes a look at this guy who's about 450 pounds, has a giant bushy beard, big curly head hair. He looks like Santa Claus. And Putin says, you look just like Karl Marx. And then he gives him a high five. And this guy high fives Putin. And there's a guy taking pictures of everything. And so Blazer puts it all on his blog. And is so excited he wants to tell Putin about it. He's going to put it all on his travel blog. And Putin asks him a favor. He says, will you mention me or mention that we're friends now? And so Blazer does one better. He changes the name of his blog to accommodate Vladimir Putin. It was called Travels with Chuck Blazer. And he changes it to Travels with Chuck Blazer and his friends meaning Vladimir Putin.
I just Googled Putin and Chuck Blazer, and there's a picture of him sitting in Putin's office. This is, it's quite a scene. I mean, the stories that go behind this. I can't wait to read your book, and I know how much work you put into it. I know how hard it is to do, and I'm sure it'll have as much interest outside of America as inside America. But I'm happy to have had you on. Keep writing and keep reporting good stories, and we'll keep telling them around here in Baltimore. Ken, thanks for coming on, man.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You got it. If you want to see some good images, Google Chuck Blazer and Putin and check all that out. And you're wondering why the World Cup is being held in Moscow this week and next week and this month. Red Card will tell you why. So Ken Bensinger's out on Twitter as well as the book Red Card. You can find me out in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. Well, we're always out there live, anywhere, anytime, podcastable for the kids, the buyatoyota.com audio vault. The morning newspaper ships to your email inbox at 7 a.m. each and every morning. That's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and planetfitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life. I mean, it's hot out. I'm feeling a little right about things. Get on the treadmill over there. They're always judgment-free, and they always have the lunk alarm there. It's the people's gym. Planet Fitness. Also, the morning newspaper includes Laurel entries for the Maryland Jockey Club this weekend. Don't forget, they have a beautiful new sports bar down in Laurel. Make sure you get down there, air-conditioned. Bet the ponies. Hang out and enjoy yourself down in Laurel, and check out the entries on the front of our website at WNST.net as well. Dennis Colossus will be here on Thursday driving you home, 3 until 5. It is the SSV on WNST. And any breaking news happens first on the WNST Tech Service. That's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.